the research at Uppsala University in Sweden. So that's why in the brackets I put Sweden, Serbia. And this is my pleasure, I would say triple pleasure, because first of all, this is the first talk of the PhD candidate. Before, we invited already established academics, but not PhD candidates. Second is that for this year, we have our first woman academic, because before somehow only academics men we invited, and they presented, not because of the choice, but because again under representation of women in academia. And my third pleasure that Yelena is also representative of the Romani community. And why it's pleasure, because even less we have academics, women, and Roma. And I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to listen Yelena today. And her talk is The Darker Side of East European Post-Coloniality, the Case of Lost Roma Signifier. I will not read the abstract. You could read this in my mail, as well as I will not read about Yelena. You can also read this in my mail and Google her. Only I will repeat that she is currently a PhD candidate enrolled in the gender studies program at Uppsala University. And previously, she received her MA in philosophy from Central European University in Budapest and BA from University of Belgrade, Serbia. So Yelena is quite international scholar already. And this is our pleasure to give floor to Yelena.
Right. So thank you, Hannah. And yeah, thank you everybody for organizing this. And I had to say that I enjoyed also the previous talks. And for me, coming from Belgrade, from Serbia, I realized that there are differences and similarities between Roma in Sweden and in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but things are not really the same. That was very good opportunity actually to learn about the local context. So when I speak about Roma now in this context, I will refer to Roma from usually like Balkan countries, so Eastern European in some wider sense, but mostly Balkan countries, Yugoslav territory. And I have like tendency to consider Roma subjectivity as something like a firm subjectivity. So I think in this context, I will not question who is Roma, who is not Roma and stuff like that, because things can be flexible. But in this context, I'm going to stick to this like hard subjectivity of Roma. Okay, and what I wanted to do here, when I started my academic career, basically, I didn't know much about race and racial issues, because in Serbia, there's like very little opportunity to learn about this. Serbia is mostly the context in which, as many Eastern European countries have this like notion of ethnicity, and this was the operator related to Roma. So race, and I am a child of Roma decade, so I would say, I operated in a policy domain dealing with ethnicity and stuff like that. So my first encounter with race was actually when I get to my MA, and then I start to be introduced into critical race theory and some stuff like coloniality, modernity, so Latin American context. And I found this context to be very fruitful when we think about Roma issues. And I'm aware that there is huge difference between when we think about race in American context, in Latin American context, in European context. What I'm trying to do is to translate somehow these ideas and concepts. I mean, it's kind of like a bold statement in many cases, and I expect people will challenge this. But now I'm just proposing stuff, and it's really not a finished work. So just bear with me, Okay, so what I realized when I read about post-coloniality, and especially this Mignolo and coloniality modernity scholars, they usually talk about a European context in this like modernity paradigm. And the coloniality cannot come without modernity. And European subject is basically modernistic subject who is, developed through enlightenment, through reason, Descartian notions of good and bad, dark and white, and all these binarisms and stuff like that. And for me, it was interesting to try to understand this context in Eastern Europe and how people actually apply these ideas, not just about coloniality, but also Orientalism, imperialism, and all this kind of mixture of ideas. So I wanted to see how Roma actually fare in this production, because there is this production. At some point after World War II, basically, Eastern Europe and fall of the Berlin Wall and stuff like that, Eastern Europe started to encounter some kind of othering and some kind of like being like not properly European situation status. And this was addressed by, especially by Western Balkan authors who, because there was this migration towards Western European countries, there was work-related migration and stuff like that. So they do start to engage with the Orientalism and colonialism, race. So yeah, this was my idea to try to find where Roma are actually in this story. Now, what I'm presupposing here is this European particularism. And this is something that I'm talking about, like when I'm talking about European, I think about Europe as a colorblind continent, basically. And this is something that I assume. So it can be challenged also, but I'm relying here a lot on this coloniality, modernity school there. And especially when we speak about knowledge production, and I'm trying to see how Roma fare as epistemic subjects. What I learned through Romology, basically, and the critical Roma studies, is that Roma were basically submitted to some kind of modernistic objectification by early Romologists, anthropologists, ethnologists. And in the context of these Enlightenment ideas, they were always orientalized, othered, and stuff like that. But what is interesting in this context is that they were some kind of subjects. You can find them as some kind of subjects. And now critical Roma theory challenges this. But I was expecting actually more from authors who are dealing who are trying to criticize this modernity through the perspective of Eastern Europe and Balkan countries. But unfortunately, what I discovered is that Roma are in this context not even recognized as subjects who can be orientalized. They are simply disappearing in some way. And I would go a little bit further in this. I just want to say that Catherine Baker wrote about race and racial issues in Europe a lot, and she's one of the most famous authors who wrote about it. And she was very critical about some ideas that came from Western Balkan and countries who were talking about nested Orientalism. And she actually has this this part when she says that postcoloniality has been foundational to how Southeast European studies has made sense of post-socialism as well as post-Ottoman cultural legacies. But it's nearly always been a postcoloniality detached from global structures of coloniality and race. And even though in my work I criticize Baker also for her approach to Roma subjectivity, I do agree with her in this. So that would be basically my statement also, that we can actually follow this. That when authors in Eastern Europe, Balkan countries, speak about race, they somehow, it becomes detached from global structures of coloniality. And okay, so now, when I think about Yes, so now I would like to give just this framework about historical continuity of the positionality of Roma. And of course, I rely, as I said, on that there is no modernity without coloniality. So I'm following Mignolo. And also, I'm considering European context that like Europe is usually seen as Christian, as white, and people who are European Christians and white, they can be considered human. So dehumanization is really important part of this context. And that Europe, as I said, is like post-World War European colorblind surrounding when we had this tendency to delete vocabulary, to not to speak about race because it was, questioned and compromised during World War II and all this. But with this comes the problem of actually, not having tools to speak about the things that continue to happen. And what I want to also to say is this Eastern European and Yugoslav race exceptionalism, especially in Yugoslav context, because it's very difficult to speak about race and consider Eastern Europeans as white because of the history of non-alignment and this kind of like being on the right side of history and helping, third countries or whatever, being in alliance with them and stuff like that. So these are some basic premises. But in this European context, Roma were always seen as less European, less Christian, as usually as non-white or even black, and less human. So this is like a general claim. But there is a lot of literature coming from critical Roma studies, speaking about othering and orientalization, and you can see it in a cultural domain. So Carmona and Newhouse are especially, addressing this issue. So you can follow up there on this part. And those, of course, church had in Romania especially important role in sustaining slavery in this territory. And this part of history is basically forgotten in European context, and often there is this historical memory which is missing, data is missing, and I think this is also really important part of this context of how Roma today fare as position themselves or their position as subjects in intellectual production. And also, I would say that Roma entered into scientific orientalization canons with gypsylorism and 19th century, science, which of course led to Nazi era, and all this is also in some way documented. It can be more, but this gypsylorism at this point is criticized a lot by Roma academics and deconstructed mostly. Now Roma academics write their own papers and create their own history, which can be also criticized, but there. So I just want to say that there is this historical line, and that in this in Europe it's very difficult to remember Holocaust as something that happened to Roma. It's interesting. You will see that when you take textbooks, for example, historical textbooks, Roma are mentioned as people who are victims of Nazi Germany, and in different countries in Europe they were victims. But like this is mentioned really like superficially. It's like just anecdotal. It's really mentioned in one sentence. So and there is some research also about textbooks, which is very interesting in that sense, how Europeans learn about this part of history. And of course, when you don't have this, memory, then of course there is no recognition of racism against Roma. There are no reparations, reconciliation especially is missing. So all this kind of things part of now setting in which people talk about race and intellectuals now. And of course, there is this terror by forgetting that when you don't have it like in a memory, then there are no visible signs in everyday life about this. There are no monuments, there is no remembrance in institutions, in culture. So and policy is also filled with this legacy of Nazi policies and completely unaddressed. Sweden had interesting cases also with policing and collecting data, and these are some kind of issues that can appear, I think, because there is this like historical lack of memory and facing this kind of racism, acknowledging that it exists, that it existed and continued to exist. So continuity is really important, and it can be seen today in different areas of life. For example, in Serbia, you can see the life expectancy of Roma is 12 years. Roma live 12 years shorter. And women even live shorter than men, which is really statistically very awkward. Usually doesn't happen. Also employment. So any kind of statistical data which you take, you can see that there is this exclusion. There is lack of, so there are no Roma in institutions. Housing, Roma live in very dark situations in Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkan. And I realize like that in Sweden it's a bit different, so I'm just trying to have this in mind. But also in education, that when you have this kind of very low very low number of people who actually can who acquire higher education and who can actually be producers and who can produce knowledge. So that's it's not by accident, right? So I just want to say that there is a systemic problem, which is actually legacy of past, and I think that's should be there as a constant. And I developed some of the ideas about how to construct Europe as in this context, and I wrote about European Gadget supremacy. In this context, relying a lot on Charles Mills, who spoke about racism in America and American context, and he spoke about global white supremacy, and I'm just trying to figure out like to play with these notions, and it's defined in my context as sociocultural, economic, political model of gadget domination based on superiority. And that we can speak about gadget supremacy, that we can speak about white racial frame, that is gadget racial frame, gadget meaning non-Roma, yeah? So, and that we can speak about white privileges, that is gadget privileges. So these are just notions that I have to develop further, but they're there just for the context. And of course, this is something that I think radicalization of this problem is in this context that we can speak about necropolitics, about slow violence against Roma who are left to die, basically in slums. So yeah, so this is something that when I'm thinking about that, there is this politics of terror and fear, that Roma are constantly surveilled and controlled and managed by this politics and memory of their own memory of Holocaust, of genocide, and all this kind of things. So basically, this is something that I think it's important to have as a context. And when I started to read the material, I expected that something of this will be reflected, right? But these are some of the works I read. And, they're dealing with, so different kind of context, but this is something that, unfortunately, what I found is that in scientific production, you can find this anthropological racism still, legacy basically of gypsy lorism. So there are publications which exist, and these are some authors who continue to speak about Roma in biologically deterministic terms. Especially targeting Roma mothers and reproduction field and stuff like that. But I like this, it was not so much my focus. I wanted to see how good Eastern European people think, so people who want to deal with race. And then I realized there is nothing, basically. So the Roma bodies basically are deontologized. The Roma lives are deontologized. This is something that the Roma are not mentioned, basically. Or when they're mentioned as a phantasm of Western Europeans who are orientalizing Eastern Europeans. And the Roma signifier is just symbol for Eastern Europeans. So yeah, so Roma are also mentioned in footnotes. So you'll see that I call this like epistemic slums. So this is a second order place, yeah, in this production. They're also mentioned by, if they're mentioned by some other authors, so there is like a second reference. It's not even direct reference, but there is like this delayed signification to Roma bodies, to Roma lives, Roma subjectivity. So this is something that I just noticed, that there is this, that Roma bodies lives, they're just like so far away. They're like very like, yeah, mediated when they're mentioned even, yeah. And usually they're not mentioned. Well, I had some examples here. For example, Bakish, Haydn, and Haydn, who talked about nested Orientalism, basically don't even mention Roma. They base this Orientalism on religion and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, basically. Goldsworthy, who wrote about also about invention of the Balkan and symbolism, like specifically says that the Balkan is basically white, excluding racialization of Roma, so they don't really exist. For example, there was yeah, so basically when Roma are mentioned, they are mentioned as victims of the Nazi regime, but there is not much engagement with this. They're just like in one sentence, and there is like victims of Nazis were, this, and Roma. Okay, so they're mentioned under demography, who is living there, for example. For example, Todorova even speaks about Romanian context and doesn't even reflect on Roma slavery there. So that was very, very strange. Yeah, so Roma women especially are mentioned as a phantasm of Western Europeans, sexualized prostitutes who, that just like this figment of imagination of Western Europeans, how they exoticize not Roma, but Eastern Europeans. That's yes. What was also interesting for me, that was that Todorova expresses also skepticism toward Eastern European anti-Semitism and anti-Roma racism. So this was very interesting because she even, thinks that Eastern Europeans are basically not so racist, and Czech Republic was maybe, but then there was this like, case that was solved and all this kind of stuff. Interestingly, Grzinic, for example, talking about gender, class, and race, introduces one Black author, Kwame Nimako, who is talking about, who is trying to be supportive to Eastern Europeans, right? And he was the director of National Institute for Study of Dutch Slavery and its Legacy in Amsterdam. And he actually says basically that this treatment of Roma in Eastern European countries is seen as a disciplining tool for Western countries. So they are trying to civilize Eastern Europeans and tell them how they should be more democratic by treating Roma in a certain way. But, like this was kind of like tossing the ball of racism between Eastern and and Western Europe, and not really addressing any kind of like real issues that Roma are facing. So for me, also one of the important issues was silencing. So it's very noticeable that Roma are not present as speakers. So they're not even like informants, maybe problematic term, but they don't really say much. They don't say anything, basically. Interestingly, Esma Recepova, who is a Macedonian Roma singer, folk singer, she was very famous in Yugoslav countries, right? And at that time, and she was very socialist and stuff like that. And they do reference her from some interview from somebody else, you know, Velikonja is speaking about this nostalgia for Tito, and to affirm like this socialist legacy as somehow good. He references her, and when she says that she remembers Tito as the best statesman in these parts because he linked us. So he was trying to make connections between people, nations, ethnicities, and whatnot. So he was, you know, brotherhood and all this. But it was interesting that there is no critical perspective on socialism or socialist oppressive policies, nothing. So this is really celebratory context in which Roma are used basically to claim again something, you know, not in their name. I mean, just Velikonja just thought that it's a good idea. Yeah. What I wanted to say is that when I see all these strategies, basically this comes with, it's not innocent move for me to say. It's not just that people are not intellectually curious about Roma, but I see them more in this context of having an interest not to do that. So basically, I'm drawing from theory of whiteness and white ignorance, motivated white ignorance, and relying here on also on this ideas of post-territorial colonies and bioproperty. Now, these are, I see Roma communities, although Roma never had their own territory, they never had land, right? So we cannot really speak about these colonies in some classical way. But there was this kind of some post-territorial colonies, basically, some post that you don't have to necessarily connect with territory, right? And this is Roma lives and bodies can be also seen as bioproperty. And because what is extracted from them is basically the meaning of Roma signifier. The value of the Roma life is very low, right? So bodies don't really count. But what is valuable is the signifier because it's very full of different kinds of, you know, ideas, imaginations, and fantasies. And in that sense, it can be used in that as a bioproperty, as a form of postmodern organization of coloniality functioning on the capitalization of commodified life. This is Castro Gomez talking. Yeah, so I'm just trying to think about this in this coloniality modernity terms. Maybe it's stretched, but yeah. So basically, Roma communities can be seen as post-territorial colonies. Their racialized lives can be seen as a bioproperty, as like a raw material, because yeah, they're just like there, they're just used. So now I don't see this other stuff. Okay. Let me just. Yes, okay. But basically, why? How is it used? The value which is used, the symbol, the Roma signifier, is used to is resignified. It's used for Eastern Europe to reference Eastern European countries, Eastern European people, Balkan, Yugoslav, Serbian, and Gaja subjectivity. So basically, this is something that I see as a move towards this kind of exploitation of Roma signifier. So that now it can be used as a for white signification purposes or Gaja signification purposes. And in the meantime, it's basically Roma bodies, lives, and subjectivities are devoured. So I'm making a reference to the Holocaust as it's named as big devouring in some interpretation. So in this context, they're again devoured in this intellectual context, and they're made basically unreal. And there is this industry I'm talking about. Production of knowledge as industry production, relying on Hontonji. He was talking about this academic laboratories in the context of course, there is Africa, and but in this context, I'm thinking about how Gajo can also be accused of doing the same thing. In this context, Roma are not really, signifier is not, Roma are not really any kind of subjectivity, basically. They're just, the signifier is basically reduced to some kind of empty shell, symbolic raw material, which is nourishing something. And it's nourishing basically destabilized identity of Eastern Europeans who are othered, who are, even we can say racialized by Western Europeans, and they're trying to recover their humanity in that sense, right? So I have a feeling that this is something that this is how Roma signifier is used, that it's filling this hermeneutical pool of Eastern European Gaje who are trying to understand their own situation, but not really talking about Roma while using Roma signifier, right? So in that context, this is epistemic and hermeneutical injustice, and I think this is something that, yeah, I mean, we can even speak about Sosa Santos, who spoke about epistemicide and murder of knowledge. And when you have this legacy of historically not remembering what happened with Roma, and when you have this colorblind, in general colorblind context, then this epistemicide comes basically is not surprising, right? And of course, it's really connected again with the death of social groups. I mean, that's Sosa Santos' idea, and conditions of genocide. So basically repeating history. Yeah, so basically, I'm just accusing these authors in Eastern European countries, Yugoslav, Western Balkan countries. So yeah, I know it's very wide. I'm just like, this is a process, and I'm trying to include a lot of other authors than the ones that I showed you. And at the final stage, I will see if I'm going to stick to Eastern European or Balkan or what. But yeah, I'm accusing them for cognitive extractivist methodologies, basically. Yeah, and this is something that I think is on the path of what Baker said, that Eastern Europe is basically dealing with race and racial issues disconnected from global structures of coloniality, and having difficulties to recognize its own whiteness. And I think that's the pattern which affects Roma very much. Yeah, so that would be it. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course, we can hear you.
Yeah, everybody was
I think
silent.
we have lost Anna has somehow vanished. So thank you very much for the talk. And let me open a bit the thing. Are there any questions from the audience? Anna tells me that she lost power in her district because of a storm. That's why she's not there.
Oh, wow.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Or
okay, may I?
Of course, of course.
Let me introduce me for a second first.
Yeah.
I'm Herbert Heuss. I'm retired now. I was working in the Central Council of German Sinti and Roma for a while. And I realized that I completely missed the scientific discussion during the last years, because working in an office is obviously not very brain stimulating. So I'm quite stimulated by your contribution, Jelena. And actually, I can agree with half of it, and or the description of Roma people. The situation they live in, I can completely agree. Where I have the problem is this contradiction that is constructed in this post-colonial approach, in this black and white contradiction. So how do you deal with the question of alliances? How do you deal with alliances in the field of sciences? What can I do, for example? Am I part of the dominant society? Am I part of the white society? Obviously I am, but am I mean, there are thousands of people who are considered white from a southeastern view. Even the German Sinti are white ones. From an even more southern view, the same. And there are thousands of people in a very weak situation. So if you just divide the world into black and white, how do you overcome it? I remember I was working with Nikolai George in the last century. Unfortunately, it cannot be continued now. But one of his points, his strong points, was how to end this what's the word?
Binarism.
Binarism, yes. How to overcome it? How to end this idea of a white subject and also of an essential black one or Roma subject. How do you deal with this frame of the thing?
Right. So should I respond now, or
yes, go ahead.
with
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, I know that things are very much more complicated than just black and white. Okay, so Roma and non-Roma, and there is a very intersectional field of yeah, I mean, positionalities are very intersectional in that sense. So when I'm talking about Roma, so my subjectivity is very much privileged in the context of the, you know, I'm sitting here in Sweden, like having my PhD, whatever. Less than 10% of people in general have a PhD in my country, like non-Roma, right? I mean, yeah, Gajo people. So I'm more privileged in that context than like many non-Roma, and also I'm especially privileged considering like Roma in Islam. And this is something that I think is it's very, very difficult to think about, and especially when we introduce class. And class is something that I think is dividing Roma community, especially now with like Roma policies, which are going towards this mainstream ideas about being, you know, entrepreneurship and whatever, like neoliberal ideas about who Roma subject is. And so there are different kinds of politics, Roma politics in that sense. So I'm aware of it. But like when I'm thinking about this, I just say that what I used is like Mills's context, Mills's material. He was talking about global white supremacy. And I was just like, whenever you turn, like I was working for European Union Fundamental Rights Agency, for example. And you take this, you know, reports from different countries, and everywhere is the same, you know, like there is like this Roma who are dealing with all the same issues. And this is kind of like European context, that there are some kind of, you know, common grounds when you think about like majority of Roma. It might not be like, you know, all Roma. Some Roma are elites, privileged people, right? And in this context, I'm just thinking that this needs to be reflected in the Roma policy and in Roma theory and whatever. And there is, of course, resistance to this. There is this idea of homogenization of Roma subjectivity, and that it will make us stronger, whatever. This collective identity, of course, requires this. Yeah, so I think there is a need to open up this discussion within. Yeah, but like when I'm thinking about alliances, I'm just thinking that people need to be aware of the positionality, even though when you deal with like Roma who are privileged, you need to know the structure, the institutional setting, and that even if like some minority might be thriving, whatever. There is some kind of different treatment that they're going to get, on different kind of terms. And I think as allies, like non-Roma people should be aware of it. I mean, they should also be critical. They're Roma politics can be criticized by non-Roma also. So I'm open to this, and I really, really don't like this kind of when people, without any kind of reservation, they celebrate whatever Roma do, and these Roma might be very privileged elites and whatever, and they present themselves as something like homogeneous subjects, whatever. And I think the alliances require a lot of this, like thinking through systems and institutional settings and stuff like that, history. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily that people cannot contribute in that sense. But like recently I read Afro-Pessimism and Frederick Wilson, and then I'm just like, this othering of Roma is very interesting because I encounter it in leftist movements, in feminist movements, like in ecological movements, environmental movements. Roma subjectivity is always othered, no matter how people try to be like good. So I'm just like, yeah, somehow I'm still sticking to this useful hermeneutical tools of black and white, at least for now. I don't know. So Paul?
Thank you very much. Very interesting, because I'm a neighbor of former Yugoslavia, but not of Serbia now. We have North Macedonia in between, and I'm in the north. And I visit very often Niš, because I used to be an invited speaker at the Elektronski Fakultet Niš, that I knew the decan, yes. I'm interested to know what is the basis of Roma Serbs in Serbia. What is their constitutional status? Does Serbia recognize minorities? Because in Greece we have no recognition of minorities, no minorities. Everybody is Greek. We have civil rights, not group rights. What's the status in Serbia?
Yeah, we have the status of national minorities, and I think 2004 that it was approved. And then it meant also that Roma get their national council, which is dealing mostly with culture, education, similar things. We got affirmative measures in education. Yeah, so mostly something like this. We had some policy documents about Roma inclusion. Of course, Serbia became part of Roma Decade, and all these policy documents, and the state obliged itself to improving position of Roma and stuff like. So it lasts for I don't know, 20 whatever years and stuff. But I would just say that the status of national minority doesn't really it brings something. It's like formally some kind of rights formally, but it's very difficult to deal with institutional racism. And after so many years and interventions, and I don't know how many funds, there are very, very few Roma working in institutions, on political decision-making places, in institutions of culture, and mostly Roma politics is today really, really segregated. So now we, for example, have, and of course, Roma are used, National Council, Roma National Council, is basically used by the dominant party for their own purposes, and they play in a certain way with the Roma representatives as they can do that. And for example, in Roma culture, we, for example, now have the European Institute for Roma, what is the name, ERIAC. Yeah, and then like you can see there also how this culture is basically segregated, because you need special body to deal with Roma culture, because institutions of culture are really resistant to thinking about these issues. Museums, history, it's very, very deeply nationalistic, and even leftists are, embedded in this like idea of non-alignment and being very, very open, good, and all this kind of stuff. So I would say it brings some benefits. There are people who got some scholarships, but of course the scholarships came from Soros and other donors. State really didn't like engage much. So yeah, there is still a struggle. So that's what I want to say.
To conclude, I see that there's a pattern of paternalization by the dominant majority. Okay, it happens here also. But my last question is there any identification in official documents that somebody is a Roma or not a Roma?
No, I mean, criteria
No,
is self-identification. You cannot really do that. I mean, yeah, I mean, Roma National Council now found a way. Yeah, you have to have recommendation from them, which give them just more power to manipulate people and all this. So it's kind of like not really, and the state accepts it. If you apply for scholarship, for example, you need to go to this, Roma National Council, whatever. Or have some recommendation. Yeah, I mean that's how it goes. And I worked for Open Society Foundation for a long time, and we were also giving scholarships in Serbia for this, like for I don't know how long. Yeah, it took. And it was the same. You had to have a motivation letter. You had to have like a recommendation from some NGO. And if it really matters or not, like if you were engaged in some activities or not, it's really like loose ground. Yeah. So self-identification. But I would say just that this really complicates the field, right? So the Roma politics in that sense is really, really complicated. And for me, it's I always have this problem of talking about leftists usually think that Roma are monopolizing other Roma. Okay, so they're like bosses of Roma, right? And they're criticizing them in that way. And feminists usually think that Roma men are actually dominating Roma women, so they need to save them from Roma men, right? So there is this gender and class and component, and I'm just like LGBT population is also somewhere missing, and even the ones who are supported basically are now supported with the same donors. So this top-down politics about Roma subjectivity, it's not coming just from academia, of course, it's coming from civil society, from good white people, good Gaja people, and I'm just like always very I'm just like criticizing everybody, so it seems like there is no end to it.
Thank you.
Makes me like a lot of issues in my life.
Thank you. Any other questions in the time?
Thank you so much, Elena. Do you hear me?
Yes, now we hear you.
Oh, great. So I apologize. Just I'm in Turkey and electricity just cut off, and it's quite often happens. But I missed the first question, but I want first of all to thank Elena for this very interesting presentation. And second, and thank you, Stefan, for taking over when I was. And now I have candles. I don't know if you can see me, but
we can see you. Yes.
So I have a question. You said that, okay, top-down initiative is not good, but what about down to top? How much really Roma, let's focus on Serbia because maybe you know better, how much really Roma understand and I would say are willing to change the situation in academia and also not only in academia? Just to continue.
Yeah, so in Serbia, when you think about like Roma academia, basically there are like 3 people. Okay, so basically what you have from Roma academia is mostly CU people. Okay, so CU academics, and they operate in all countries, and there are very few of them. Okay, so this is some kind of problem that I would say, because they of course are the most selected one, the privileged one, and all this. I mean, I belong to this group also. So we are imposing certain kind of narratives and discourses and all this. And people are trying. I would say that Roma academics are facing different kinds of intersectional issues. Like, even though, like, yeah, we can be privileged and all this, but you find yourself in academic institutions, for example, let's say Uppsala, and I'm just thinking about, like, you know, Institute for Eugenics and all this kind of stuff, like that there is like a body of Roma prisoner in a museum, and we heard about that also. I mean, it was just academia is very, very difficult place to be, and really, yeah, I mean, there is, like, of course, motivation for, you know, people to change things, but it's very hard work, I would say. And not that I'm not critical towards Roma academics, okay? I'm just like, yeah, in Serbia, you have basically mostly Roma people who finish like high school, and then they got some, you know, higher education, but people usually try to get away from the country because, like, you know, everybody tries to get away from, you know, Balkan countries and stuff. So you cannot really have this, you know, some steady intellectual elite. Even during these 20 years of decade, for example, I can remember Romology school from Novi Sad with Svenka Savic, for example, and she's really, really, she contributed to so many, you know, generations of Roma students, and wrote books and taught them how to do research and all this kind of stuff. But these people are now all scattered around the world. You know, so there is no continuity in that sense, no continuity, and every, like, Roma movement and every generation starts from scratch, basically. So, yeah, it's very, this is something that we call, I mean, it's hermeneutical poverty, basically, you know, that you don't really have enough people to contribute to this pool of knowledge, so that, you know, it gets really developed. I mean, I'm referencing mostly CU people, right? You know, but I'm trying to find alternative angle using, you know, modernity, coloniality authors, something like from American context and stuff. So it's very patchy, and I'm coming up with new terms. I'm inventing terms because there is nobody who thought about this in that way. So, you know, I basically transcribed everything from Mills, you know, about whiteness, you know, and Gajo privileges, Gajo supremacy, and all this. So for me, it's very exciting. I can say it's very. I feel that my knowledge production, it's very much different than knowledge production of non-Roma people because it brings sense to my life. Okay, so it makes it meaningful and allows me to understand what's happening to me. So feminism didn't allow me that, you know, white feminism, you know, Gajo feminism. So. Yeah, so I'm just like, I think people do want to change. People do want to change the things, but I'm also aware of the opportunity for, you know, getting your position in a dominant society and not really changing the system. And this is something like token Roma academics are, you know, they're, yeah, I mean, there is this kind of like, you know, posing, you know, next to famous people, whatever. And not really doing much, but it has a cost. It has a cost, and people are sometimes ready to pay, sometimes not. You know, it's very comfortable. It's very comfortable to be in academia in some way, you know. Right, I don't know. I mean, I'm just like, I'm trying to be like critical, but at the same time, you know, I'm aware that it's not easy for Roma academics, whoever they are. Yeah. Anna has a question.
Thank you for such sincere question. If somebody else has a question.
Anna has a question.
Yes, thank you. And thanks a lot, Jelena. I find this really compelling argument and very kind of fresh. And if I were to translate it into my, you know, my specialty, I think you're kind of calling for like a kind of radical epistemological honesty, like to always kind of specify where you sit and what's your relation to the research object. And sometimes this relation becomes like a bit of an impasse, like you would have to end up renouncing this relation in order to be fully honest, if I'm getting that right. But I have a couple of questions. I think one might have to do with like just how things are formulated in different fields. And I just noticed you use a lot of passive voice, like is reduced, is othered, is, and I would like at some point to specify like who exactly does it, the gaje, some gaje, the politicians, the system, the, you know, that's the simple question. Yeah, another one I think is kind of what Hannah already asked. When you talk about this empty signifier, that kind of is awkward for everybody, this signifier. So should it be reclaimed and filled by Roma, and by you know, by which Roma, and how, and should the, you know, gaje kind of stop referring to it altogether? And this is kind of brings me to my third question, because you mentioned like kind of the gaje always talking about Roma, for instance, in terms of what gaje society does to Roma, is a way of talking about, of self-referencing, talking about ourselves. But this is it's kind of a damn if you do, damn if you don't kind of situation. Because I don't think we need to kind of stop acknowledging these processes, but while you're acknowledging it, you're also doing this kind of epistemic violence. So I know this is not supposed to be like gadget therapy hour, but like how can I, you know, make sense of this contradiction? Thank you.
Yeah, so it is very yeah, very general, gacha society, because I'm when I'm talking about it, I'm just having this like European gacha supremacy context in my head. And then I refer to gacha institutions and like gacha culture and, you know, gacha whatever. So yeah, it's a little bit like floating. Yeah, and maybe that needs to be clarified. Yeah, definitely. Right. Yeah. So about the signifiers, everybody feels uncomfortable. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to to put it in this context. Like, no, gajo people should not use in any context this signifier, right? I'm not really saying that. I'm just trying to say that when people use it, they use it in a certain way, which is exploitative. And that they don't really reference Roma lives, Roma bodies, what happens with, you know, with them, with Roma subjects. And then this Roma subjectivity doesn't exist at all. So that is what I'm like challenging, okay, that you cannot really speak about race in Europe, orientalization, othering, racism in that context without acknowledging whiteness of European authors. And they are not really ready to do that because they usually see themselves as victims of Western European countries. And that's, you know, I mean, I'm not like saying that people are not othered, you know, Eastern European, if that term, we can use that term. But yeah, I mean, but like in the way how they deal with race, Roma must be somehow differently positioned, right? And yeah, I mean, I found Aniko Imre, for example, she was the one who was talking about race for a long time, racism against Roma, for example. She was really one of the rare authors who actually addressed Roma for themselves, like their own issues, their own problems. Other than that, people just spoke about themselves. And in this context of modernity, coloniality, I'm hearing also this like this term global East. Now, of course, there is like Russian, you know, context like oppression, and of course, people can use this kind of terms and also use this like post-colonial theory for their own purpose. I'm not saying that you should not do that, but just like as Becker says, like this is really you know, disconnected from the global context, and people don't really see Europe and their positionality in comparison to, you know, Latin America, whatever. So, and when they speak about like global East, I'm just like realizing that the global East ends with Eastern Europe, and there is no like China or like Japan or whatever, I don't know. So it's kind of like very like narrow interpretation of global East, right? So I'm just like a bit like, okay, we should be careful about that. Yeah. And the third was, sorry, I forgot about the third.
This was the third, about like how to talk about these things.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
if I may have a follow-up, since I don't see any hands, so why not? Does it, okay, this is like purely analytical kind of question. Does it help to have this like broader, let's say, global perspective? Does it help to conflate categories, or does it help to focus on the particular? In which case, you know, even like differences between Roma in different regions of, I don't know, Serbia matter more than, let's say, comparing Roma in Eastern Europe to Roma in Russia or to other oppressed minorities elsewhere. It's it's not a trap question, I'm wondering.
No, yeah. I mean, it's very complex. I mean, Roma are different in all these countries, and the diversity among Roma is huge. I mean, I didn't know a lot. I mean, I didn't know a lot about like Resande people, about the Swedish context. You know, for me, it was like surprise. And when I'm talking about like, and I'm like more and more aware of this, you know, like I should be careful, like, and like limit myself, you know. But just like because of my experiences of working in Serbia and like you know, for Fundamental Rights Agency, which targets you know countries, you know, EU countries, and that's why I feel a little bit more comfortable like generalizing. Okay, but I do think that there are important differences, and like if you are dealing with yeah, just like a theoretical framework, which might or might not be useful to you know capture some part of you know situation in certain kind of countries, and I would not relativize it completely, you know, because you can see by statistics that you know many Roma face similar issues. Yeah, but I would say yeah, definitely. I mean, there are differences that need to be reflected upon. Unfortunately, I don't think that's a major trend. I think that when people think about Roma, there is like tendency to homogenize. And I wrote about this in a chapter about Roma feminism, Roma women's movement, you know, that we are creating our canons, and some people, some Roma are getting excluded. And you know, we are talking about this Roma woman. Who is this Roma woman? You know, like poor Roma woman in slum and whatever. You know, and then based on this kind of symbolic, also it's kind of exploitation, right? So that then you use this kind of signifier for your own Roma positionality. So that's also an issue, right? Yeah, so I think only recently I think people want, you know, don't want to talk about class. For me, that's important. And especially Roma women and mothers, like poor Roma mothers, because they are the image which like dominant mainstream Roma elite is trying to like ditch, because we don't want to be identified with poverty. We want to be identified with, I don't know, business, entrepreneurship, whatever, successful Roma. Yeah. And I wrote some paper about that. Like I criticized, you know, some campaign that yeah, I don't even remember. Eric probably made it or something. You know, like there was this picture of the same person, and then they were at one picture they were dressed like poorly, like very poor Roma, trashy, whatever, you know. And the same person had this like on the other picture they had this like you know successful power posing, whatever. And that was kind of like we want to deal with stereotypes about Roma and to say we are not like this, you know, this is your imagination, your Gadget imagination. But I was like, no, this is also your imagination. You know, this is kind of like problematic and like distancing and othering poor people. Yeah, so for me, that's an issue. yeah. There are more like, you know, LGBT people and queer people and trans people. Yeah, I mean, just very, very different positionalities.
Thanks.
Thank you. And more questions? If not, I have another question to you. You started to talk about the stereotypes, and definitely we have hetero stereotypes and homo stereotypes. I mean, when others produce stereotypes about different groups, and when within the same group we have homo stereotypes, means stereotypes produced about Roma, but within Roma. And here I wanted to ask you again, maybe easier for you to give an example of Serbia. I wanted to ask you about those stereotypes which are produced by the Roma, if they about the Roma, if they exist. I mean, of course, definitely you cannot talk about all Romani groups. I don't want to generalize here, but if you, what do you think about producing stereotypes about Roma from the Romani groups?
Yeah, so there is this like kind of interesting paper. Yeah, I forgot who wrote it. What is it? Yeah, anyway, but it was about Roma musicians, right? And this music is interesting in the sense that Roma music is also very much seen as a tool of talking back or whatever, of creating, having an agency, and being how to say, creative. Yeah, I mean, it's something that some Roma usually have like a pride in, like take a pride in. There are Roma families who are, you know, in music industry, and they get successful, and this is one place where Roma people are allowed basically to be, you know, and this is something that is also a setting that's provided by, you know, Gaje society. So you, for example, would have Roma students who are excelling in musical academies, you know, and nowhere else basically. So there is a stereotype about like being Roma musician, but it is interesting how Roma can also, you know, take it upon themselves, you know, and say like, oh, we are born with, you know, genes for music or whatever, you know, and that's something that's very interesting for me. But I mean, I wrote something. I mean, I think that music, for example, can be also. I wrote one paper about blues epistemology, about folk music, and there is this folk musician Vida Pavlović, who is very famous. I mean, was very famous, and during Yugoslav period especially, and everybody liked her, you know, Roma and non-Roma. And it was very interesting, this phenomenon, when she sang, people would hurt themselves. Okay, so that's kind of like that was, for me, that was interesting because it was so powerful, and because she was singing these songs in Serbian, which were like ballads, romance, whatever. But like when she spoke about, you know, on Romanesque, these were, you know, songs about suffering, about death, about you know, father leaving his family, very, very difficult issues. And in that case, for me, it was like, wow, this is actually at the time when nobody really produced knowledge about Roma lives. And I interpreted this production as something that's like blues epistemology, basically. And this was a place where Roma could find a recognition of their own suffering, and that was really hurtful, but at the same time empowering. And in that case, I think like this kind of stereotype about Roma musicians, it can be like that Roma musicians play sometimes for Gaje, but then there is like another, you know, way how they do it for Roma people and for themselves. And you have to play with this like Gaja masks always. And sometimes people like embrace it. Sometimes people just like, you know, I'm referring to Fanon. Sometimes they just like stop realizing that there is this mask, and they just like, you know, consider that is it. but like, yeah, so it's very difficult because sometimes it's very useful for people to embrace stereotypes in Gajo world because it's profitable, it's a survival tool, you know, and so I'm just like, why people do it, you know, I'm just like sometimes really, I'm not going to be like very judgmental of people who are actually producing stereotypes about Roma in that sense, like if they're trying to earn money to survive, yeah, you know, but like when I'm thinking about Eriak or, you know, people who are a little bit like higher on the class, you know, ladder, I'm just like thinking, okay, maybe that's not just survival, you know, I mean, it is in a way, but you know, yeah, it can be different, right? So, you know, I mean, and there's politics behind that also, you know, why people do it, why people produce stereotypes about their own groups. It can be useful sometimes.
Yeah, definitely, because we don't talk only about negative stereotypes, we also talk about positive stereotypes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree here that they may be useful. But yeah, thank you so much. So some more questions? I think no. I just wanted to mention that Miriam and Mishko have left, but they expressed gratefulness to you for your lecture, and they were very interested in your talk. I just want to pass this what is on chat, and also I saw that Herbert posted the link for encyclopedia on the genocide of Roma and Sinti, which Carola thinks directed. Just again mentioned, it's not about your topic, but I just want to reflect what is on our chat. And if you don't have any more questions, and you don't have.
I have a quick question, just because sorry, hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't have the correct link, so unfortunately I didn't hear most of your presentation. So just a quick question, whether you're going to be publishing this as a paper, and then I'll be waiting for it to be published and looking forward to it.
No, I didn't actually. That's yeah, unfortunately. I mean, I will try in the future to do something with it, but at this point, I actually, yeah, I was called by a friend of mine actually who did some race-related issues, Eastern Europe, whatever. And she was the editor, and it was like a Routledge publication, whatever. And then it appeared that there is always this politics, like when you want to publish, like what you have to do for things to be published. And I just feel like this is part of this, you know, how it is in academia to publish as a Roma, you know, and some things that she required from me were just like for me unacceptable, related to the, I mean, yeah, very, very few people who are editing these things and talking about race are, you know, mostly they're Gajo, and they don't really like understand things that I'm writing, and then I have to like explain stuff which I don't think need to be explained, and then for example, I'm accused of like not giving overview of other Roma women or Roma authors or something like that, like, but it's just like I don't have to do that, you know. And something like this kind of thing. So I just want to say that that was like one experience that I decided not to publish in this publication. But it's a matter of social capital and being yeah, skillful in that sense, because academia for Roma is just very difficult on different levels. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. I hope that it will be published at some point.
I mean, if it would be okay just to maybe send me an overview of the literature or the slides. I mean, it's perfectly fine if you say you don't want to send me the slides. I could just post my email in the chat, maybe.
Yeah, sure. I will send it to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And I would add that it's not only the problem to publish for Roma, but also about Roma. As a Gajo, I can say, in any case, when you write about Roma, you have to explain many things, and then also to prove. I mean, prove from the point of view what actually white people wouldn't ask you to prove about themselves. So this is really not only about the Roma, but also generally about the topic. And I hope that next year we will pursue our volume based on these talks which we have now. And Yelena, I would be very happy for your contribution to publish your research, how you would like to do it in this way.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, then thank you so much. And then I think we should conclude, and our next lecture will be on April 17th, Wednesday. We try to have all lectures or talks on Wednesdays. And of course, I will send an email.
And I will make sure
with
that
working Zoom link.
And I will make sure that I send the correct
Yeah,
Zoom link.
as usual, 1 week before.
Yeah.
As usual, 1 week before, and then 1 day before as a reminder. And thank you so much, everyone. Yelena, particularly.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Yelena,
everybody.
thank you. Bye. See ya.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you.